It's late hour. I left Dr. Lemoyne's presentation right when it was getting good, but everybody has said it was so good. So I'm going to try to catch her on Monday, see if I can get some of what you all just got. As I said, thanks for joining me. My name is Renee Aziz, and I'll tell you a little bit about me, and then I want to see who's in the crowd before we jump into some slides, which we will do quickly. I promise you'll be able to go by 7. I am a school psychologist by training. Vicki is my other school psychologist friend in the room. So I am that by training and spent many years doing school psychology work around the Indianapolis area. But I started my career as a behavior consultant in the Indianapolis Public Schools. Anybody work for IPS here? Previously, okay. So I started there, and then my experiences there really working with students with emotional disabilities prompted me to go back and get that school psych degree. And so I did that, then started practicing in school psych. And after I kind of transitioned from that traditional role as a school psychologist, I started working for the Indiana Department of Education. And I was the project coordinator of a grant that went around the state of Indiana training teachers and all other stakeholders on some of our best practices going on in education right now. Things like response to intervention and positive behavior support and culturally responsive instruction. So I did that for several years, was up and down the Indiana highways, and then took a transition about 3 years ago to start my own consulting business, and so that's what I'm doing now. So I work a lot here in Indiana, but we also do some things nationally. We're in Louisiana every month and also visit some of our neighboring states. So I'm glad to be with you here today, and I'm going to share with you, again, this is a presentation now 45 minutes long that is really designed to give you an awareness of many of the things that Dr. Lemoyne was talking about in terms of knowing our current reality. You know, she talked about for decades we have been struggling to really figure out how to meet the needs of culturally diverse students, right? And we are still talking about that right now. So my attempt in this presentation is to, like she did, give us all some true definitions of really what the problems are so that we can better be able to articulate where we need to design our courses of intervention. And so after sharing with some data with you, and I'd like to hear your feedback on the data that I present. Anybody who knows me in here, a couple people do, can tell you that I like the back and forth, so I hope you'll engage with me in that. But after I show you some of that data, what I'd like to do is show you and talk to you about 3 specific strategies that are being promoted here in the state of Indiana and nationally, actually, that are really around the best job that we can in meeting the needs of these culturally diverse students. So, does anybody watch Gayle King? It's like my favorite show on the radio. I guess you don't watch, you listen. But she always starts, hi everybody, she starts her show with, let's get started. So let's get started. Again, here are our objectives. Just again want to show you about the current reality of Indiana. We'll look at Indiana ISTEP data and some discipline data. We'll talk about those best practices that I mentioned, RTI, PBS, and culturally responsive instruction. And then we'll just quickly gain an awareness of the role that culture plays on learning. And just like I know Dr. Lemoyne talked about, the focus has to really be that we have to change our mindset to know more about our students so we can respond to where they are currently. And so I'll take a different perspective than her in terms of, you know, she's an expert in language. I'll talk to you about some of the communication and behavior styles that we also need to know about if we are to not misinterpret behavior of students that we're working with. So before I move on into that data, tell me who's in the room. How many of you are teachers at the elementary level? Okay, lots of elementary. And then secondary? All right. You're the lonesome one. What about administrators? Administrators. Okay, who else is in the room? I see consultants. Miss Gwen. Good. Oh. You know what? In Louisiana, I mentioned my work there. In Louisiana, my work is focused on really helping that two specific parishes on behavior. They suspend I work in 2 high schools in 1 parish, and they suspend 55% of their student population. So they really have some behavior issues. And we in that parish just did a bus driver's training last summer, and they were like, everybody's always forgotten about us, but it's something we really, really need to know. So I'm glad you're here. Thanks. Who else is here that I didn't mention? It's Jackson, Dr. Jackson. How are you? You won't remember me, but I'll fill you in later. I used to work at IPS. Yeah. Well, welcome. All right, so I'll try to keep in mind kind of your roles and discuss maybe some things that are more pertinent to who's in the audience. Okay, so when Dr. Lemoyne began, I was like, she has seen my presentation. Because just like her, I think before we do anything in terms of what to do, we have to know where we are, right? We got to know the data. So I hope you like data, because data is one of my favorite words, and I think that it's critical that we always make data-based decisions. And just a couple of slides about that. Decisions that we can base on data, of course, help us to be more effective and efficient in decisions that we make. The quality of that decision-making, though, I really feel often begins on that first point, and that is defining the problem to be solved. As a consultant, I'm called in, and they'll tell me what they want me to do. Renee, we need you to teach us about interventions for math. And I'm like, okay, what are we basing that on, right? What does the data say about our current math performance? Why do we just jump and say math? Sometimes, without accuracy in defining the problem, we think we're meeting the needs that we have, but when we look closer at the data, we see all these kind of prerequisite things that we need to take care of before we ever can get to the math, for example. Reading is a great example of that. Like sometimes we need to teach this kid how to be a fluent reader, but what if they don't know phonics? Right? We have to do phonics before we can get to that fluency. So defining the problem, which we'll do in a few minutes with these slides about our current reality here in Indiana, will help us know what we need to do as advocates in our school buildings with our colleagues and even our administrators to really be able to more articulately speak to what we need to do for the students who are in need in our schools. And the other thing about data, people think, oh, I'm looking at all this data, but it's not giving me answers. Data doesn't give you answers. It can help you ask the right questions, but they're not going to tell you what to do, but they give you things to think about, helping you, again, identify that problem, define questions that will lead to more questions, and helping you look at even more data, and then most importantly, designing an effective action plan that's really targeted to what the data says. So with that said, let's get started. In 2007, our Governor Daniels, appointed a commission. Right? Now, Gwen knows all about this. Has anybody heard of the Indiana Commission on Disproportionality in Youth Services? Several of you. Good. Well, that commission, again, created by the governor, was asked to look at 4 areas: juvenile justice, child welfare, education, and mental health. So we were supposed to look at disparities in each of those 4 areas. And of course, as an educator, I was on the education committee. And as a part of that report, which any of you can Google and find, again, the Indiana Commission on Disproportionality in Youth Services, we wrote about some of these Indiana statistics, again, as we tried to define what were the disparities that we face in Indiana. Here are just a couple. African American students are 2.6 times likely to be labeled as mentally disabled. How many of you are special educators? A couple of you, okay. 1.6 times more likely to be labeled with an emotional disability, right? So our EH classroom consultants. And in terms of what we call least restrictive environment, which we all know, right? We have some special ed students who are in general ed classes and special ed classes. But what we're finding that is even though the field of education really promotes inclusion, when we look at the data, African American students and Hispanic students equally are more likely to be served in these separate classes. So they get less access to the general ed classroom, the general ed curriculum. What happens when we have less access to the general ed curriculum? You don't learn that general ed curriculum that you're supposed to do what? Pass ISTEP, right? Exactly. So that's an inherent problem there. And again, the statistics go on and on. The last two are more about behavior. Students are 4 times more likely to be suspended out of school and over 3 times more likely to be expelled. African American students 3.6 times more likely than white students to be in alternative ed programs, and even our Hispanic students also have some disproportionality in terms of alternative placements. Okay, so that just really presents a crisis, right? Crisis mode, but there's a lot of problems there. Where do we start? So I like to look at data. When I'm consulting in districts, what I try to do is help them get a solid foundation of what's going on in their district. So my intent of presenting all this data for you is not so you can go out and spew it to somebody else. I don't want you to do that. They'll be like, she's crazy or he's crazy. I don't want you to do that. But what I do want you to do is, having seen this data and the kinds of ways you can think about data, I'm hoping that then you'll be motivated to go back to your own school and work with your colleagues to look at data in this way. That's really how you can begin to make change in your school. So let's start with ISTEP data. As we look at the data, I have 2 prompting questions I want you to think about. First, just in general, what statements can we make about the data? Data is supposed to be what? Subjective or objective? Objective, right? So we should just be able to make a statement, not what we feel or how we interpret that data, but just what the data says. So think about that. And then also, being that we have to just state what the data says, I want you to think about what additional questions the data generates for you. Okay? So we'll start with the data that we always see, like in the newspapers and etc. We see statistics about the percentage of Indiana students, that are passing ISTEP, right? This is all grades. This is just the state of Indiana, right? And what we see here is that 72.1% of Indiana students pass the English and language arts portion, while 75% pass the math portion, and 64.8% pass both the English and math portions. So again, if we're answering that first question, just describing the data, what does the data tell you? What hypothesis or what statements can you make based on just these couple of graphs? Are we doing well? If you saw this data in the newspaper, what would you say? We're all right. We're all right. Average? What would be a good benchmark for us? Right? No, our federal law says that we should have all students passing at 100%, right? So that's the question it generates for you. What is being measured on the ISTEP? So what are they showing proficiency in, right? Good question. What else? What other questions did it? Yeah, Gwen. Who's not passing? That's always my question when I see that. And when I see, we have a great education reporter in the Indianapolis Star. I've never met him, but if I ever get to meet him, I'll tell him he does some really good stories. But so last year he wrote a story that said the achievement gap is closing. How many of you saw that? Did some of you see it? And I was thinking, well, I want to pull that up and see for myself because that's not my experience. But anyway, but when we talk about that, we're really looking at these large-scale pictures of the data, not really digging deeply into, as Gwen says, who's not passing or what are the weaknesses that remain, right? So we can see increases overall, but are there still groups of students that are not meeting expectations? And so that's where I want to take us next. Looking at what groups are meeting expectations and what groups are not meeting expectations. This is our own state's data, right? 2008, 2009. So tell me your reactions as you see this data. So now we can talk about groups of students, and I've just highlighted 3. Of course, we've got more categories than this. But African American students in 3rd grade, 58% pass English, 49% pass math, 57% pass Hispanic students, 57% pass, while 53 pass math. And then our white students, we see 80% passing English and 76% passing math. So here we saw this global picture of how our students are doing. Here we see more specific to subgroups. How now, what does the data tell you now? What kind of statements does that generate for you? Yeah, Angela. Okay. Yeah. Yep, green is math. Yeah. Yeah. So that's what we can say. We can say we see differences in the percentage of students passing I-STEP by race. Can we say why? No. Right? But we can say that that is. How many of you came to this conference last year? I'm a regular, right? We had a huge discussion last year. What was it about? In terms of achievement gaps. What did we talk about last year? Poverty, right? Like that's another elephant in the room, I think sometimes. Many times it's race, but you know, it's hard for people to talk about differences in SES. In my experience working with schools, anybody that knows me knows that when I'm working with a school district, I always try to think very specifically about what the needs of students are and what the needs of teachers are. And I think that, you know, in my experience, our teacher ed programs can do a better job of really talking to our teachers about culture. And so there's probably no work that I do that doesn't tie in culture. What do you think about that? I saw your head. What does that mean?
No, I agree.
You agree? Okay, good.
Because if you have a lot of low-income schools and it's not taught, the cultural competency is not taught anywhere.
Yeah.
And I wonder why. It just makes me wonder why.
Yeah, and you know, the more work that I do, I used to be on this. Part of the reason why I went to graduate school for school psychology is because I wanted to prove that our achievement tests were biased and IQ tests should not be given. Well, I found out differently. We really couldn't just throw out the whole, you know, the baby with the bathwater. But so I kind of pulled back from that, right? But what I found in working with people around culture is that I don't think people are ill-motivated. Like, I don't think our teacher programs are not doing it because they don't want to. I think they don't really have the skill to. Like, how many of us knew anything about standard English learners? You know, not a lot of our teachers know about that. I happen to because that's what I do every day. But our teachers don't know that. So I don't think they're not being taught that those concepts of culture because it's, you know, not seen as important. I think our professors really lack some skill in that as well. But I brought up that whole issue of poverty because a lot of folks like to stay here, right? And then when they see this, they say, my experience, you tell me if you've ever heard this, they say, yeah, Renee, but that's really skewed. Like, it's really a poverty thing. Like, if you looked at poverty, you wouldn't see as great gaps. It's really that students in poverty are struggling to meet our academic expectations. What do you think about that? True, somewhat true. You completely disagree? What?
I think somewhat true. I work at Anita's First Chartersville Veritas Academy in South Bend.
Okay.
We service pretty much entirely low-income families.
Yeah.
And right now we're dealing with the same problem. Like if you look at the test data, that 100% of our black males failed ISTEP. And then
They're also 100% free lunch, right?
we're also, yeah, we just got school-wide Title I, so
Okay.
we're doing 100% free lunch school-wide.
Okay.
But also if you look at our white population that's low-income, they didn't their gap range isn't much higher than that. So there is some truth to the poverty being a part of it because they don't have the experience or the background knowledge
That background
or the
information?
access to technology.
Okay, good point. Would anybody say something different or agree? Yeah, Vicki.
I live in Pike Township.
Yep.
House, which has a very high African-American population.
Yep.
But it is not that high poverty. It's
Right.
very-
Right.
And their scores look a lot like this too. So it's not just poverty.
Not just poverty. And that, I think probably if you're here at this conference, we probably are all on the same page. That, of course, poverty plays a role, right? We all can see evidence of that. But I don't want anybody, I really want us all, if we can encourage, one of our colleagues to look at data a little closer, it would be that poverty doesn't explain it all away. And that's kind of something I try really hard to do in all the schools that I work in. And I think, again, I don't think that our schools look at data in that way as often as we really should. So they are having fun in the Mojo room. I think that's why I think it's the Mojo room. Here we've been sticking with third grade. Here's that, the 8th grade. We see those achievement gaps. 10th grade, we got even lower percentages here, some slightly lower here, right? But hey, we've not met those needs, and so we're losing lots of our students, right? We have a high dropout rate. We have low graduation in our state, but this is a consistent issue. It's not like it's just an elementary issue. These patterns carry on. But here's what I want us to look at quickly. If we look at the percentage of students, let's stick with third grade since many of us are elementary, and we do look at that poverty issue. Here's what I help schools do. So here at the top is our Hispanic population in third grade. And the state, actually when I used to work for the state, we did look at free students in getting free lunch, students getting reduced lunch, and then students who are, of course, paying for their lunch. Now the state kind of lumps the free reduced together. So that's what you see here. But if you're in your school, I really encourage you to break those apart. You'll see even more fascinating trends. But here's what we have that's provided to us by the state. Our Hispanic students on free and reduced lunch, 26% of them, statewide now, pass ISTEP. Special ed kids, thanks. Hispanic paid special ed, I've broken it up. I forgot I did that, Vicki, thanks. Special ed and gen ed. 41% of our Hispanic paid, so non-poverty Hispanic kids pass ISTEP. This is according to poverty there. Let's look at gen ed. 56% and 71% poverty. African American, you can still see that across all of these areas, we see lower percentages of students passing ISTEP when we aggregate it. Some of our colleagues would say, see, proves my point, that poverty is what is really the issue we need to work on. You don't have to talk about SELs. Teach me about culturally responsive practices. We need to figure out how to give our families resources, right? Because it's a SES thing. So I like to then look at achievement by specific groups and see what gaps are there, right? So here, Hispanic, now we're just looking at gen ed students. Hispanic free and reduced, Hispanic paid, we see that gap. That's what we just saw. This is just showing you the gap. So here we've got a 15% gap, here we've got 11, here we've got a 14% gap, although you don't see that line there. Here, if we look at the influence of race now, African American paid in gen ed and white students who are paid, also gen ed students, we see a 20-point gap. Hispanic and white students, we see a 19-point gap. And African American and Hispanics, we see a 1-point gap. So think about this graph and what you see here. And what added pieces do you notice? What can you now say about the influence of race? It's there, right? It's there. What's your reaction to this gap? What might that suggest?
We're missing something culturally, since Hispanic and
Right.
And there's a huge gap from Hispanic African American to white.
Right. I would say that that's again, the data doesn't give us the answers, but it leads us to more questions. So I would want to know, what is it that we're doing to meet the cultural needs of African American students who are performing at about the same level what is it that we're missing with those students that we seem to be capturing with our mainstream white kids, right? So race, again, my point here is just to encourage you to encourage your colleagues at your school buildings to look at data in this way, because I think too often we just get stuck on the subgroups of just all free and reduced lunch all together, or black, white, and Hispanic, and all the other categories as well. So part of what I want you to take from this piece is to encourage your colleagues at your building to look at data in this way. In the interest of time, I'm going to move past many of the other slides that I had. Talk about discipline real quick, because there's an important piece here. Lots of statistics about discipline. Indiana suspends over 1,700 students a day. Just like I showed you early on, students, African American students, who are about 4 times more likely to be suspended than white students. And here's what we see here. These are just for special ed kids, because that's the only data that the state really collects in that way. So we need to really be encouraging our Department of Ed to look at gen ed kids, not just special ed kids, but what's the reality for our gen ed kids. But this is what we have. So you can see here that the relative risk ratio just means, it's fancy terms for how much more likely, right? So African American students last year were 3.5 times more likely to be suspended. Look at this, 10 or more days, not like 1, 10 or more days than white students. Actually, that's a combination of suspensions and expulsions. So what behaviors are, yeah.
Is there an age difference there?
That's all, it's all students. It's all students, yep, K-12, yeah. Now, we do have, some of you may know, Cindy, you might know that historically, this data was collected by the Equity Project at IU under the leadership of Dr. Skiba, who I'm kind of an apprentice of. I went to graduate student with him. I was a research assistant for him, and working with him again now on some grant. But so historically, he had collected that data for Indiana and worked really well with districts to kind of be able to come up with a plan to remedy that. Well, last year, starting this year, that project is not doing that kind of data anymore. It's kind of outsourced to another group, West Ed. So at this point, we don't even know if we'll be able to have those breakouts that Russ used to do for us. Fingers crossed, but yeah.
Do you think that RTI was put in place because too many kids were being mislabeled, or if they felt they were just bad, or they have AD, or
Yeah.
all of these things in place to protect children that were being just thrown in?
Yeah, well, when we get to RTI, I can tell you a little bit about the history of RTI. The history of RTI came really out of the special ed, kind of camp. But the whole model of RTI is not about special ed at all. It's really based off of a public health model that many of our doctors and physicians were using since, the early 70s. In that respect, I think RTI is broader than just the issues that maybe now it's been interpreted to mean. But certainly in our state, which at this point has no mandate for RTI necessarily, except for in terms of our special ed language, that we can no longer use this discrepancy model. We probably all know that, and looking at a student's IQ and achievement and saying they're eligible for special ed based on that. Now we've got to look at additional things. We can't just do that. RTI is one way that we can do that. So, but other than that, and that's the only kind of mandate, if you even want to call it that, because there are other options as well. But that's the only mandate that our state has to even use RTI. Now, we have a big fancy document up on the DO website. Have you seen that? It's pages and pages and pages. Yeah. And now, did you notice it's called response to instruction instead of intervention. Our superintendent likes the word instruction. So it's response to instruction here in Indiana. So I think that, again, my personal opinion is that RCI should be used in a broader way, but can it support the needs of students who are being mislabeled and who have chronic behavior issues? Absolutely. And it should be. Shouldn't just be used for those students. It should be used in a proactive way. But I think that's the impetus for folks to kind of jump on board to help resolve some of those issues. Absolutely. Yeah.
Suspension and expulsion data.
Yeah.
Every school is required to collect that data and send it into the state, aren't they?
Well, it's part of the school improvement plan that you collect that data. However, our state does not make that data public. Just don't. You've gotten public data from that? Oh, in the newspaper? Yeah. Yeah. Oh. Yeah, you can request that. And of course, you can request any data and they give it to us. You know, but you know, Gwen, as part of the commission, what we said, that nobody should have to request it, right? It should be something that lives on our Department of Education so we all can have access to what's going on with our students, right? So Gwen is absolutely right. You can data and see how your district is faring specifically for gen ed students, or go to your district person who does data, and they, I mean, again, it's information that's collected. It's not always collected accurately. In Louisiana, every time I'm there, we go every month, I look at the number of students who have been suspended 4 or more times, and they're required to write a behavior intervention plan for any student, gen ed or special ed, who has been suspended 4 or more times. It's just what we do. And every time they're like, no, that's not right, that's not right. So there's some inaccuracies in our data reporting system that we probably need to work out. That's a whole nother issue. Don't they? Yeah, absolutely.
Right, and they, okay, if there's, such and such is a mouthy person.
Yeah.
Okay, when you do this, this is gonna happen.
Consequences, right.
Consequences for it, and you get a break, or,
Mhm.
it really is a proactive measure.
Isn't exactly. And behavior intervention plans you're talking about, inherent in those is that you know the function of the student's behavior, right? So you should know why the student is mouthy, like what purpose is that serving for the student, and then you can connect specific interventions to help deal with some of those issues. But let me get you, I was talking about this data. Dr. Skiba, again, Russ Skiba down in Indiana, we did a research study a few years ago when we looked at just Indiana again and looked at what students are disciplined for, right? And we found some black students. What would you imagine they would be? Defiant for who? In both? Both students or one group?
I'll probably say African-American.
Defiance, that was on the list. Disrespect, fighting. Anything else? Language, cursing, all that, profanity, yeah. Physical, fighting, yeah, I would probably say physical, yeah, fighting. All of those things are on the list. However, what we were able to pretty easily tease out is that there were some differences in what we call subjective behaviors and objective behaviors by race. And I encourage you, again, look at this in your district, in your school. What do I mean by that? Well, there are lots of infractions that students were suspended for, right? But we only found 8 significant differences. For the white students, they were referred more for discipline sent to the office for more objective things like smoking, vandalism, leaving class without permission, or obscene language. Right? If I know what obscene language, if I hear the F word, I know what that is. Right? There's no, was that a swear word? We all know that's what that is, right? But look at the African American students. You said disrespect. Excessive noise. Okay. Threat. Again, what could be threat to you might not be threat to me. Like, is this threat? Like, what is it? Loitering. What is loitering, you all? Totally hanging around. Exactly. Now, I always say, I was telling Angela, my friend Angela, that she knows, she's been in relations before, that I always somehow manage to have a story about my family. I try so hard not to, but I always do. So whenever I, talk about loitering, that is certainly a part of culture, right? African American culture, hanging out. If I were to go around my husband and his buddies, they hang out. Like they're grouped up, hanging out. Now, I personally grew up in a community that it was me and David Daniels. We were the only two black people in the school. So I learned not to loiter. Like, that's not what we did. Nobody was loitering, right? And I'm making generalizations here. Not all black people loiter. I'm evidence of that. But that's part of the culture. But sometimes it can be misinterpreted as, hanging out, doing what you're not supposed to do. And that really, the intention is not to be disruptive necessarily, but it's to engage in a social activity, right? Yeah.
It's funny you say that, 'cause I can even think of, I'm from Indianapolis, I grew up here.
Uh-huh.
I remember my high school years,
Uh-huh.
a lot of what African American our age did
Uh-huh.
was on East 38th Street.
Oh, driving up and down, didn't we?
There was no problem, but everybody parked there, the music was
Yeah.
hanging.
Uh-huh.
The police would come and they would.
You would be out of there.
But it wasn't like I said, there was nothing.
Nothing going on.
Even when I think of summer celebration.
And cancel the song also, yep. Exactly.
Being down here, but now the big thing is,
You gotta be off the street.
And I know times, I'm, older now, and I know,
Yeah.
times have changed this.
Yeah.
But that was just a part of it.
Right, it's
So
part of the
you know,
culture, right?
celebration
Yeah.
Because you came downtown and you quote unquote hung out.
Yeah, right. Remember the old Soul Fest and all that?
Heard the music.
Yeah.
That was just a part of the
Right, absolutely. Yeah.
It's funny because when the bus drivers, when they see the children get off the bus,
Oh, they hang out.
and they're not going home, they're hanging out at the bus stop.
Yeah.
Uh-oh, it's
Beep,
a
beep.
ride.
Yeah. Oh,
It's
something's
a
going on.
ride.
Yeah.
So then they radio in because and that's interesting.
Yeah.
Because we just, it's like assume there's gonna.
They're
they
starting
think there
trouble.
is,
They're
maybe
helping.
there is
Sometimes there is, right?
language or whatever that would, but that's interesting to.
Yeah.
And the excessive noise, that's really big
On the bus. Yeah.
And I don't know,
Well, you notice I'm not using a mic. If I had a mic, you would be out of here. Like, I can't even take her. She's too loud. Sometimes my husband, again, will say, "Why are you talking so loud?" I just talk loud.
so is that a cultural thing?
Absolutely. And you get around again, generalizations. We're not stereotyping. It's part of culture. Just like in your culture, maybe it's that you take turns. You wait for the other person to stop talking and then you talk. There's none of that in African America. We are all talking at the same time and then the pitch goes higher. It's cultural, right?
That was all right.